Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Welcome, Karl, to the Hall of the Ancestors.
Well, thank you, Alan.
We usually start with place and date of birth. So,
Northampton, Massachusetts,
yeah,
January 21st, 1935.
right. Well, from then we go on to your parentage. As far back as you like to go, people who have had a significant influence, your parents or grandparents, something about their characters and interests.
I suppose I should start with my parents. My father was an Austrian psychologist, Gestalt psychologist, at a time when Gestalt psychology was not very popular. He had done his PhD. He grew up in Graz, from decayed aristocracy family. He came to the United States, to Smith College, to work with Kafka, be an assistant for 1 year, 1930. Met a graduate student, an American woman, Grace Moore. He must have arrived in September of 1930, and they were married in December of 1930, and stayed married for the next 50, 60 years. I was the first of 3 boys that they eventually had, and grew up in what should have been a bicultural environment, Austrian and American, but I didn't realize at the time. I didn't realize my father spoke with a strong German accent until, I don't know, I was 10 years old or something.
When did he come to America?
1930.
For any particular reason?
It was a job. It was a 1-year job. Jobs were pretty scarce in Germany, and he had by then been working in Hamburg in a lab, a psychology lab. He was mainly interested in he wrote an important book called The Psychology of Interpersonal Relations. But I think a little anecdote that is probably very important. In 1940, he and a Smith College graduate student, Mariana Zimmel, made a little film. And I remember clearly watching it being made in the 3rd story of our house in Northampton. It was kind of schematic, and it had a little, I haven't seen it for years, a circle and a triangle, and 4 little long sides that would form themselves. It was a stop frame, so they did one frame and then moved a little bit. And the circle would move around and touch the side of the box, and then the triangle would get out of this box and move, and the circle would move, and so forth. And they used that for an experiment to talk about what became known as attribution theory. People watching the film had no problem attributing human emotions and motivations to what were just little geometric figures moving around. And I think that's always been in the back of my mind, and I'm not sure. Recently, I realized one of the things I'm most interested in now is how to use visual materials for research. That's somewhat different than making ethnographic films. And in my research in West Sumatra in the last 20 years, I've been trying to develop various ways to use video, and primarily video, in the research I'm doing on emotions, and using them as stimuli in the same way. And I've forgotten when it came to me, but what I was doing was formally quite similar to what my father had done in 1940. He was not an experimental psychologist. He liked to think and take naps and so forth. He was not an experimental psychologist. And he was very much, when I started working on emotions, he was very opposed to the idea that there were any cultural differences in emotions, that there was any cultural component to emotions. And I think I don't think he ever read anything I wrote, but to the extent that he would be willing to talk about it, he really didn't approve of it. I mean, he, like most psychologists, he thought he was dealing with pan-species phenomena, balance theory, attribution theory, the kinds of things he was working on. I'm not scarred by, I'm not saying that his disapproval scarred me, because I was quite sure I was right and he was wrong. But there it is, the use of visuals for a visual a little film for research, I think must have lodged in my mind. Anyway, he also would, because he spoke quite good English, but he was always teaching in English, and even though my mother knew some reasonable German, he would never speak German at home. And even later, when his 3 children studied German in college, went to Austria, he wouldn't speak German with us. And that his life before 1930 was a closed book, and it was really, he didn't really want to talk about it. He eventually wrote an autobiography, but it was very late in life. She was also a psychologist, completely worked with him. She eventually got a PhD and actually eventually retired as a professor emerita. We moved to Kansas in 1947, and they had done research together with the deaf, the Clark School in Northampton. We moved to Kansas, and I went to high school in Kansas. Really, at that time, that was a bad moment. I hated Kansas. I went straight back to Massachusetts as soon as I graduated. But that summer, when I graduated from college, I always had an interest in Indians and things, and we traveled through the West. And that summer I went on a archaeological dig in South Dakota with Carlisle Smith, a University of Kansas archaeologist, and spent the summer on a Dakota reservation, and we were digging. I was a shovel hand, $17 a week plus room and board, and the experience of that, doing the archaeological research, which is very easy for a 17-year-old to actually do something, and then getting to know the shovel hands were Kansas high school boys and boys from the reservation. But in the evening, the landowner, Dakota, Bill Boyce, would come down and tell us stories and tell us about, see that bluff over there, that hill, let me tell you about my grandfather's, how he went up and starved himself, and the Blue Racer came. It was his grandfather's vision quest. Well, to hear that at 17, I mean, I'd wanted to be I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And halfway through the summer, I realized I was hooked with anthropology. That was the summer of 1952, and I've been doing it ever since. So I went to Williams College, a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts, partly because my mother had gone to Mount Holyoke College, a women's college. But they had no anthropology at the time. So I kept doing field work in the summer in South Dakota, but then transferred as a junior to Harvard, which was at that time, 1954, one of the few anthropology departments in the country. I had high school friends who were at Harvard, and I'd go down and talk to them, and had an interview with Hallam Mobius and with Ernest Houghton, who was actually just a month before he died. And he put it to me, well, you can either stay in Peabody and do real anthropology or go to social relations and do that other thing as an archaeologist, which I went to Peabody Museum, well, the Department of Anthropology. And then I knew so much. I knew a tremendous amount. Goodness, I was so smart. Well, I'd had some experience, and I was not nearly as smart as I thought. But took courses from Cora Dubois. Later, as a graduate student, and afterwards, we became very close. And I have the greatest respect for her. But at that time, this was the first time she had taught undergraduates in her career. Well, anyway.
What are you trying to say? That she wasn't very good at
She was very tense, and she was not very good at communicating to arrogant teenagers at Harvard and Radcliffe.
But she was a lovely person later and very bright.
Later, I'm sure she mellowed, I mellowed, and we, yeah.
Were there other teachers there who you remember?
Overall at Harvard, I went back for my PhD. The three great teachers I had were Cora Dubois, Clyde Cluckone, and John Pelzel, whom the world doesn't know about. I think he's still alive, but he was a Japan expert.
That's why I've heard of him.
Yeah, marvelous teacher. And of course Cluckone.
You better say something about Cluckone. I've heard some anecdotes, but
Well, they're probably all true.
Florence? Did you meet Florence?
Never, thank goodness.
But Cluckone himself, what was he?
He was absolutely brilliant, and he would get up. I didn't have him as an undergraduate because he was away 1 year, and I only had 2 years at Harvard as an undergraduate. I came back 2 years later and I was in his last seminar before he died. That was just a marvelous seminar, and he knew a little bit about everything. And he would walk back and forth with his squeaky crepe rubber soles, and he had a John F. Kennedy. This was at the time that John F. Kennedy was doing this at us, and Cluckone would do the same. And he'd just pull information and make connections, he was fantastic. Yeah, when I eventually published a revised edition of my revised version of my dissertation. I dedicated it to Clacon, and sent a copy to Cora Dubois, and she sent me back her photograph, a studio photograph of Clacon, and said she was so happy to see, she didn't say anything about the dedication, she was so happy to see someone of my generation who did not eschew functionalism. She was terribly pompous in lots of ways, but yeah, there'll be a biography of her, Susan Seymour, who she took to, on her Orissa project, is working on a...
How is Seymour spelled?
S-E-Y-M-O-U-R.
Yeah.
She is emerita at Pomona or Pitzer, one of the little colleges.
Yeah. What about your contemporaries? Were there any anthropologists being trained at the same time?
Oh, yeah. In my class, actually, well, people, Olaf Prüfer, Herman Bleibtreu, Marguerite Robinson,
Nice.
who
Yes,
I've lost contact with all of them. But people I knew overlapped. We had, Olaf Prüfer came from Tübingen. He was a bit older, but as an undergraduate. And he had been digging in Pachala as the kind of archaeologist to the Prince of Patiala, the tiny little princely state in India, P-A-T-I-A-L-A.
And the man's name himself?
Olaf Prüfer, P-R-U-F-E-R. He's now teaching or emeritus at Kent State. And there were a lot of graduate students. We would, after the Peabody Museum library closed at 5 o'clock, we would go to Harvard Square to the Hayes Bickford cafeteria, and it became almost a, well, standing joke. We called ourselves the Hunters and Gatherers. And it was mainly graduate students, and then people like Olaf and myself who had done several years of summers of field work. And there was a graduate student who had graduated from Harvard, went to Harvard Business School, and then came back as a PhD student, George Appel.
Did you become friends with George?
Oh yes, yes, yeah.
Can you say anything else about him apart from your friendship?
Yeah.
Because we've got an interview with him.
George was always driven, and he it's hard to describe him in 1954 because of what, I mean, now he is one of the most morally driven anthropologists. Well, I can think of two extremely morally driven anthropologists. One's Laura Nader, and then the other's George Appel. They were both there, but it's George who really put his money where his conscience was, yeah. And he and Laura were always driving forces in the whole Borneo community, organizing it, and so forth. And then he did the first book on ethics in anthropology, I believe. The real book.
Yeah.
He took the Harvard Business School case study method, where they would, instead of teaching, I don't know, principles of business theory or whatever, they give them little case studies. Okay, here's a little business that's going bankrupt, and figure out what. And he did that so he used that as case studies for anthropologists. And he picked our brain. This was much later. This would have been in the 60s. And he'd pick our brains for moral dilemmas. And then he'd slightly disguise them. I have several moral dilemmas in that first book he did. One of the great, but see, he wasn't a team player. And yeah, why did he never have a tenure track position
That's a question.
as he should have? Maybe because he had independent income, but he also wasn't a team player. I mean, he would have made a lousy assistant professor. He
Said what he thought.
he said what he thought, and you know, that may not be the very best strategy.
Yeah.
But he also would rather be in his house on the little island off the Maine coast, where he was very productive. I mean, he's very productive. And
Laura you knew as well.
and Laura, of course, she had been Joe Brew's secretary at the Peabody Museum, knew a lot of anthropology from that standpoint. So it was a really ideal thing. And at least one of his daughters is an anthropologist. Two, yeah.
Well, they teach, and one's in the Peabody, and one teaches school. But
Yeah. I suppose I met them when they were little girls, but I don't have any contact with them. George and Laura don't come to AAA meetings anymore.
They are actually going to the next one, I think.
Oh, really? Oh,
I think
very
so.
good. Yeah. Well, anyway, so there, George, Oriol Pisunier, Spaniard via Mexico.
What were the things you were discussing at that time? Was it still functionalism, or was it the influence of any particular anthropologist? I mean, you were reacting against the ages of, the sort of Benedict Mead cultural anthropology era, presumably, by now.
Were we?
Maybe you weren't. Maybe you were still.
No, okay. Give me a few weeks and I'll have a really good answer for that. What were we talking about? We were taking so many of the same courses. So we were reacting to things we were reading, like Julian Stewart and people like that who were talking about cultural evolution and talking a lot. I was, as an undergraduate, and even beginning graduate school, I was still very archaeologically oriented and thinking about the problem of typology and taking a huge number of artifacts you got from a site and figuring out the typology of that. There was
Moving on.
well, let's move on. Yeah. He's still undergraduate.
Yeah.
Houghton died in the spring of '54, just after I'd interviewed him, and they hired Bill Kelly, who was an American. He was the head at Arizona of the Institute for Native Affairs or something at the University of Arizona. And he taught an introductory course and Southeast Indians. So I took these courses, and they were pretty low level, the freshman courses and so forth, but I'd had so much anthropology, then he suggested that I was looking for something to do my honors thesis on, and talked a lot with him, and eventually he directed me to the Fort McDowell Yavapai Reservation near Phoenix, Arizona. He said no one had done that since Gifford. And Gifford had taken the Kroeber's trait list thing, and so there were 2 monographs answering each question of the trait list. And it was said, I learned later, Gifford was deaf. And so his transcriptions of Yavapai words may not have been, well, I didn't try to learn Yavapai.
How do you spell Yavapai? As it's
Yavapai. They were human Yavapai, Havasupai, Wallapai, that group.
And to check out his hearing.
No, not really. I didn't know what I was doing, to be honest. I went to spend a summer on the reservation and the Social Science Research Council at that point had an undergraduate research grant program. And I got one of those and bought a secondhand Jeep from a friend, and it was enough to let me do this research. They've long since discontinued it, but American universities, I just yesterday stopped being Dean of Undergraduate Studies at University of South Carolina, and one of the activities I was trying to push was undergraduate research. And now almost every American university has some kinds of little funds for undergraduate research. But in 1954, the SSRC was practically unique. It may have been unique. Anyway, I spent the summer on the reservation, came back, and actually wrote a nice little honors thesis about acculturation. Remember that word? Acculturation. Yeah. And there was a nice little gimmick in it. And yeah, it was a quite respectable thing. And I had I had every intention of going straight on to graduate school. The house I was in, Winthrop House, did a Gilbert and Sullivan every spring. And for some reason I was asked to be director of the Mikado. But I love Gilbert and Sullivan. So I directed Mikado. And the cast party, they gave me a book of the Ukoya Prince. And then the next week I was called in to interview for something called the Sheldon Traveling Fellowship. That Harvard had one for undergraduates, and each house nominated one person. And by then the Rhodes Scholars had been taken off the board and so forth. And so they interviewed me, and I said, well, what would you do with it? And I'd been thinking about this beautiful book and about to make, well, I'll go to Japan and travel across Asia. And that was the first time that, well, they gave it to me. And it was the first Sheldon who'd gone to Asia since Theodore H. White in 1936. But he knew Chinese, and he stayed during the war, and I knew nothing. But it was a change from the pre-meds who wanted to visit the great hospitals of Europe. So I spent the next year slowly traveling across Asia and hooking up with anthropologists and just traveling everywhere. $200 a month, $100 for transportation, $100 for food.
Quite a lot at that time, I suppose.
The American dollar was very strong, 1956. And did not, ironically, get to Indonesia, where I spent the rest of my career. Did some archaeology in Thailand, published that while I was on the road. And then when I was in India, applied for a Austrian government fellowship. I'd always wanted to spend time in Austria and really find out about that part. So I got that fellowship and then wound up in Vienna and at the Institute of Ethnology, where Heine Geldern and Kolpers were both extremely old.
Yes.
They may have been our age. Heine Geldern said he came out of retirement. Since I'd just been in Southeast Asia, that was his great love.
Yes, of course.
Well, he said, okay, I'll come out of retirement and I'll teach these courses. He was wonderful. He was, of course, great nephew, I think, of the poet Heinrich Heine. Many people called him Herr Baron.
That's very strange because I was taught by his student, Christoph, and he was known as the Baron. He was a Baron, actually.
Yeah. Well, so was Robert von Heine Geldern.
Yeah.
His assistant was the Gräfin, the Countess, Anna Hohenwald-Gerlachstein. And he'd spent so much time in America that he was not your typical Austrian, German professor. And he did spend a tremendous amount of time with me. Very, very generous. At one point he went off to give some lectures in Japan, and he just told the Gräfin to give me the key to his office and let me use that tremendous library. Although I don't know why he needed it, because he could remember. Of course, he was interested in trans-Pacific contacts.
Yes.
And this spiral in Hallstatt, in the Austrian Iron Age, was replicated by a design on a pyramid in Mexico. But he could say, well, oh yes, I've seen that. It's in this book, page 36. Yeah, there it is, there it is. I mean, it's just extraordinary. He had been a prisoner of war during the First World War in a Romanian prison camp. He'd been captured by the Romanians. And he always said, you know, one of these days I want to really learn good Romanian. But that got me very much involved. And I think one of the reasons I've now been working in Minangkabau, West Sumatra, for so many, 2 decades more, was his fascination with those Southeast Asian, you know, the multiple roofs. You got all over Southeast Asia and in Norway. But
What about I've always thought that Heimendorff's interest in photography and film was related somehow to this Austrian background of interest in the visual arts and so on.
no sign of it.
No?
No.
They didn't take lots of photographs and do filming?
No.
No.
I can't think of anything film-wise there.
Or photographic. They were interested in, as you said, motifs.
They were interested in motifs, yeah, but that was just straight out recording.
Yeah.
No, I don't think, I can't.
There wasn't a visual element.
Oh, no. Koppers was, he wasn't senile, but he certainly was not an interactive intellect. He would come in, of course he was
Watch out, yeah.
oh, whoops. He was a priest.
Yeah.
And he'd come in, go to the lectern, take out his notes, read his notes in almost unintelligible German, and try to figure out and leave. And I'm sure he didn't know who anyone was in the class. I mean, it couldn't have been more different. Although they were, I think, exactly the same age. There were a couple of Americans around, other Americans. One was someone I had known in high school in Lawrence, Kansas, who was then called David Hoare, H-O-R-R, a noble, a very distinguished intellectual. Well, there was a president of Harvard named Hoare, but they could never name a house after that president. He later changed to, his name is now David Agee, Agee, as in James, the critic, the script writer, and so forth. Let us now praise famous men.
Yeah.
Anyway, David was there, and it was basically serious faculty, but the students, the economic situation in Austria, 1957-58, was so bad that we were the only full-time students. The Austrians had to have jobs, and there were no scholarships, I mean, for fellowship. They had to have full-time jobs, and they'd come part-time. I mean, it was still pretty grim. The Institute of Ethnology was above the Spanish Writing School stables, and you'd have to trudge through the horse droppings as you went up. But it was very exciting, and partly because that was my first real experience with becoming not fluent, but foreign fluent in a different language. And I just immersed myself in the theater and the opera and the music, and culturally that was very, very important. I was still going to be an archaeologist. I was going to go back. I discovered a Bronze Age site in Thailand and got very much interested in the Dong Son Bronze Age with it. Do you know those wonderful cast bronze drums?
Yes.
And the axes, the wonderful axe handles, axe blades. So that summer, after that, I dug in at the Abri Plateau in the Dordogne with Hallam Movius, and our relations, which had never been terribly good, got a little more strained. I had a lot of, so I went back, but I went back to a four-field department at Harvard, which meant I took as much cultural, social, whatever you'd like to call it, as I did archaeology and physical and linguistic, and with the whole mix of students. So when the time came that I moved from archaeology to, Movius, he really didn't trust me. I think what got him most, when I came from Vienna, of course, I had a little bit of a Viennese accent in body language, and of course there's a lot of bowing and he picked up on that, and that offended him tremendously. He told me later, I just couldn't understand why you were scraping and bowing. Anyway, but then, there are all kinds of stories about Movius. We don't need to go into all of those. The bottom line was he would not support me for a grant to go back to Thailand. I asked around the department, and it turned out that the University of Pennsylvania had a running dig at Tikal, a Mayan site in Guatemala. So I got onto that. And in those days, I smoked very heavily. Well, we all did, most of us did. And the Peabody Museum was a flammable building. So one would have to go out, in nice weather, one would go out and stand on the front steps. And there was this other smoker who worked down in the basement, and I'd kind of known something about him, and that was Robert Gardner. Oh. So we spent a lot of time smoking on the front steps of the Peabody Museum. And I had thought, I'd never done any movie stuff, but I had done a lot of, especially that trip across Asia. I did a lot of still photography. And one of the places I was most interested in was Angkor, the Khmer ruins around Angkor Wat. And at one point, I just fantasized to Gardner, it would be really neat to do a film. There are these great friezes of all kinds of they're the royal armies charging each other on elephants and so forth. And then down at the bottom, they're just little it's like what the French do on their cathedrals with the saints and so forth, but then little gargoyles or little people doing things. And I said, you could really do a kind of interesting ethnography if you used a camera to search out on these friezes. And that didn't get anywhere, but then when I got when I was signed up to go to Tikal with the Pennsylvania people, Gardner said, why don't you make a film?
Was Gardner already making films? What was he doing in the basement, as it were, at that time?
He had finished working with John Marshall. He helped Marshall edit The Hunters. He was brought in. Well, we could spend a lot of time on Gardner. He was brought in to make something of John Marshall's footage.
Yeah.
And at first they worked together very well. They're both basically poets, but just because two poets are poets doesn't mean by the time they finished The Hunters, their relationship had, shall we say, deteriorated. And at first, Marshall didn't even put Gardner in the credits of The Hunters. But Gardner, the Film Study Center in the basement of the Peabody Museum, had been started basically with a, shall we say, an anonymous gift from a family. And Gardner was the director of that.
Why are you coy about that anonymous gift?
Well, anonymous.
Oh, I see.
I'm sure it's the Marshall family that put the money in.
I see. It's anonymous, yeah. Okay.
But it was anonymous, I don't know. What are the limits to anonymity?
50 years.
All right, well, okay, Lawrence K. Marshall. So Gardner was really to be part of The Hunters, which clearly was an important film from the moment it was released. But Gardner wanted to do his own film.
Yeah.
And in 1960, a Dutch New Guinea official, Vince de Bruyn, head of the Bureau of Native Affairs for Dutch New Guinea, came on a tour of the U.S. to try to drum up interest in anthropology. And Gardner immediately jumped at that bait and put together the Harvard Peabody expedition to New Guinea. Well, that summer, the summer of '60, it turned out Pennsylvania had a 16 millimeter movie camera. So they sent it up, and Gardner spent an Saturday afternoon, showing me how to load it and wind it up and use it. Wind it up and use it, and sent me off. And then I came back at the end of the summer with decent footage, and I was editing that into what was my first film called, with the exciting title of Tikal. He was showing me how to edit and how to splice and so forth. And at that point he had another graduate student in mind who was, then it turned out, severe arthritis meant he probably shouldn't go to New Guinea. So he asked me one day, would you like to go to New Guinea? And needless to say, I jumped.
Was this because he wasn't an anthropologist?
Who?
John
Gardner?
Gardner.
No, Gardner had done all the coursework for a PhD.
He had.
He had taken, and I assume passed, his orals. And then came the offer to direct the Film Study Center. And that was too good enough, and to work with Marshall's footage. And he couldn't turn that down. He had made He had been in history, a graduate student in history at the University of Washington, and had been involved in making 2 or 3 films on the, what we used to call the quacudal, kind of acted films on quacudal myths. So he'd gotten a little touch of working with film, and so then this came up. So he was trained.
So why did he need you to go with him?
Well, he was going to be full-time with a camera.
Yeah.
I was going to do a doctoral dissertation somewhere, so I was quite willing to commit to learning the language, spending a couple of years there, really getting into it. In retrospect, we did it the wrong way around. I should have gone for 2 years and then Gardner came, but life doesn't always work that way. So I went out in the spring of '61 and then stayed on for, well, total, in various trips, almost 3 years. And have indeed about half of the things I've published, well, the ethnographic things.
This is on the Dani.
The Dani, yes, yeah. So I've gone back again and again and written quite a bit about the Dani, and then made a couple of films myself on the Dani with the exciting titles of Dani Sweet Potatoes and Dani Houses. And did work. I was second camera on the Dead Birds, the first thing. So we worked together very well, and still do.
You get on well with him?
Yes, yeah. Which, he can be difficult, and he's tried to work with, I'd say, maybe a dozen anthropologists, and only Okosh Oster, probably, and myself were what you'd call successful collaborations. And
as a filmmaker, I mean, we don't want to talk about him too much, but that film is particularly well known and famous.
Yeah.
Is there anything about him as a filmmaker or in that experience that stands out?
In retrospect, okay, this is something, I think there are 4 great ethnographic filmmakers who, within a very short time, laid the foundation, did all the important things. And that's, of course, Jean Rouch, John Marshall, Bob Gardner, and Tim Ash.
Yeah.
None of them ever took a course in cinematography. I still don't know where Gardner learned how to use a camera. According to Jean Rouch, he just bought a camera and took it to West Africa. John Marshall bought a camera in a store in Harvard Square, and the guy behind the counter showed him how. Tim Ash studied still photography with Minor White, but again, so that Gardner had and still has. He's 82 years old now. He is physically not what he used. I mean, he used to be a ballet dancer, a major tennis, not major, a very good tennis player. He just had extraordinary energy and was always out there, either asking, in New Guinea, always.
Very curious.
Yes, and one of the things when people really want to attack him in Dead Birds, they say, well, how did he know what the Donnie were thinking? The answer is the same way any of us know what people are thinking. We talk to them, either directly or through interpreters. And I mean, he was always out, working, doing, either shooting and doing ethnography. Since then, he is now published, he's about to publish yet another book on the making of dead birds. And when this comes out, we'll have 3 or 4 books by Gardner about those few months and about making dead birds and so forth. It's a unique, no one else has done it, although James said that, what's his name? The Australian filmmaker. Ian has been doing something similar or working with people who are doing it. But yeah, Gardner was just, from the beginning of having the boxes made to ship materials in the basement of the Peabody Museum. There were some carpenters, and he had them made exactly to the specifications of the airlines and so forth. I mean, it was...
he was filming in 16mm.
Yes.
And someone was doing the sync sound with it.
No sync sound.
There was no sync sound.
No possibility. Michael Rockefeller had a Nagra, and he was doing wild sound, and it's then synced, post-synced.
He was killed, wasn't he?
Yes, well, or died, or was eaten by sharks, probably.
Yeah. So it was sound parallel sound.
Yeah. No, let's say, in the fall of 1960, when we bought the equipment, there was no, well, Jean Rouge sort of did in the middle of Paris, sort of sync sound. Ricky Leacock was experimenting with real sync sound in Washington Square in Manhattan, but there was nothing you could take out to New Guinea.
Yeah.
I mean, he could, in this latest book, when that comes out, you'll see the trouble he had with 16mm in the humidity of New Guinea. It'd get jammed in the gates, and I mean, even just plain old 16mm was a problem, but there was no possibility. 10 years later, sync sound was available, but that's Michael Rockefeller's sound.
Yeah.
How do we get there?
So you're just beginning your PhD, so you proceeded with your PhD.
I went to Guatemala that summer, came back, and then Gardner asked me to. And because of the four-field approach, even though I'd been nominally an archaeologist, I could sort of sashay across and function as a cultural or social anthropologist, ethnographer. It was not all clear sailing. I had trouble with my orals, but that all worked out. But I did have the kind of the grounding of which many American departments still consider themselves four-field and do insist on that kind of training. I never went back to archaeology. I mean, then I came back, wrote my dissertation. The irony was, it was to be a material culture dissertation. I would deal with every object in the whole Donny repertoire. What's difficult to explain now is I didn't realize that this was one of the very rare times when an anthropologist actually saw tribal warfare going on.
Yes.
And of course I was interested in it, but I was not prepared at all to deal with it, to think about it. I was still getting excited about stone axes and, oh yeah, wait, gosh, I've got to go to that battle. Hold on, well, I'll be right back with the stone. Well, that's just the way things are.
And they were actually using the stone axes to
Yeah.
kill each other.
No, not to kill each other. They were using bows and arrows
Yes.
and spears.
Yeah, yeah.
But they hadn't gotten machetes or steel axes at that time. So I came back, and as I started to write it up, in the process of writing I like to think of what came out of it, a dissertation, and then a monograph called the Dukum Dani, the last of the old-fashioned ethnographies that covers everything. And actually it went out of print. It's just been reprinted as a classic in anthropology by Transaction Press and Rutgers, and which is kind of interesting. I don't dare read it now. I don't know. Then I spent another year at Harvard as an instructor, and then went to Brown. By then I was fully a cultural anthropologist, and I have never taught archaeology since then. But I've always been very much interested in the artifacts and the material culture and so forth. And
What year was this? About?
drifted, well, I finished my PhD in '66,
Yeah.
went to Brown. No, I really finished in '65. Spent '65, '66 at Harvard as an instructor. Went to Brown in '66, and spent 5 years at Brown.
This was the Vietnam years. I mean,
Yes, yeah.
were you involved politically in any way?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. Brown, yeah, I was quite involved, and as against the war. And we had a very, Brown was one of the few places where there weren't student riots, because the faculty, the engaged faculty and the students were both, shall we say, liberal, but not radical. And so we had a lot of activity at Brown, but it was, I still think, very constructive. And the Brown Board of Trustees gave an honorary degree to Bob Hope, who, if you remember, was very much of a hawk. And everyone was so outraged that then 2 years later they had a student faculty committee to honorary degree committee, which was a real breakthrough. I was the faculty chair, and an undergraduate who later became famous and infamous in the Carter administration, Ira Magaziner, was the undergraduate chair, and we got them to give honorary degrees to Beverly Sills, the opera singer, but for her work with children, and to I.F. Stone, who was the most interesting journalist. And I think the trustees had no idea who I.F. Stone was, or they wouldn't. But anyway, this was a real triumph, yeah.
Were you beginning to now think of a new fieldwork area that you were?
Yeah, I then started corresponding with someone who had been in that course of Cora Dubois. He was 2 years behind me, Jim Siegel, who had worked in Sumatra. And I said, I thought I worked at one end of Indonesia. It was Indonesia by the time I left. And where should I work at the other end, in Sumatra? Thinking Heinegelder and houses and so forth. And Siegel, who'd worked in Aceh, which I had no interest in going there, Siegel said, well, there's the Batak. And he said, well, there's this Batak and that Batak. But what I liked was the euphoniousness of the Pak Pak Batak. So I went to, started looking into it, and really I was appalled by the language situation. That is, there are many different Batak languages mutually I didn't want to learn another language that...
Maybe 10 people could speak.
Yeah. And I was writing grant applications to Batak and kept thinking, well, if only it were Minangkabau, if only it were. And then at some point I had this epiphany, well, why not Minangkabau?
Why not Minangkabau?
Or why not Minangkabau?
Yeah.
Well, really, and how the move from material culture to psychological anthropology. I mentioned that my monograph, Dukum Dani, on the Dani, which was my, thank goodness no one will ever see my dissertation. I don't think anyone ever read it. I don't think my committee read it. I'm pretty sure my committee didn't. I hope my committee didn't read it because they should not have passed it. But anyway, so I spent a couple of years rewriting it. And one of the things I said in passing was that, so this was a comprehensive ethnography, say something about everything. And I said the Dani have a 4 to 6 year postpartum sexual abstinence. I came back and I never had any doubts about it and just wrote it. And when I would mention it to friends and relatives and my psychology, my family at that was also, my parents were both psychologists. One of my 2 brothers a psychologist, my first wife a psychologist. And they said, no, you must be wrong. 4 to 6 year postpartum sexual, you can't do that. I mean, that's not human. The upshot was that became an obsession of getting back and trying to get more information about it, to either prove or disprove it. The National Science Foundation anthropology panel had no interest in this, but the Foundation's Fund for Research in Psychiatry gave me money, and by that time I was married to the psychologist, experimental cognitive psychologist, Eleanor Roche, who is, so we went to New Guinea. She did some what turned out to be very important color work, spinning off of the Brent Berlin, Paul Kay stuff. She did what I think is an extremely important methodological paper that was published in Man on methodology and why I was wrong when I said the Dani have 2 colors, dark and light. Anyway, so I did work on that, and it seemed to verify it. And actually then I thought I'd better make sure. I published an article again in Man on the Dani low energy system, which I would not call it low energy anymore. about the postpartum sexual abstinence. Suddenly had my 15 minutes of fame. I was in the newspapers and Time and Playboy and on morning television and so forth. But that, well, the upshot of it is most anthropologists still don't accept that, which is very curious. Psychoanalysts have told me, well, Freud would have been very much interested. He liked new data. But my anthropological colleagues, who are supposed to be culturally oriented and resist this and say this just can't be true, the data have to be wrong. Rather than spending the rest of my life arguing about that, at that time, then, as I was leaving, as I was getting married to Eleanor Roche. Eleanor Roche was a graduate student, mainly of Roger Brown's at Harvard in psychology, living in a house just on the edge of campus with some other women who married interesting people. One married Richard Lee, Nancy Howell. One married Carl Sagan. And one married a psychologist, Paul Ekman. None of these couples are married today. Eleanor Roche and I got a grant to go back, and Foundation's Fund for Research in Psychiatry. We stopped off in Berkeley and actually stayed. Elizabeth Colson gave us her house. She was going down to Southern Caltech for a quarter to work with Ted, I'm blocking. She did the collaborative work with Ted on the, anyway.
Not the Plateau Tonga.
What?
Not the Plateau Tonga.
I don't think so. I thought.
I've got an interview with her on the way.
It'll come back.
Yeah.
Anyway, so she, we lived in her house and used her wonderful library of detective stories, and then went back. But staying in the Bay Area, we picked up with Paul Ekman, and he was working on facial expressions. So, facial expressions of emotion. And he suggested that we replicate his experiments, which he'd done mainly with American subjects here, to see if the Donnie, who had been virtually unexposed to Western media, and they'd had a fair amount of experience with Dutch patrol officers, but so we said, well, of course, the facial expressions, that's all cultural. We did replicate it and found that the Donnie replicated very well the pan-cultural findings that Ekman and his colleagues were getting, with one exception, and that was that the expression, when you showed them a pan-cultural anger face, they would say anger. When you showed them a disgust face, they'd say anger. So they made that error. It happened, I'd already published that Dukum Dani monograph, and I'd already explained how that would be possible. That is to say, Dani do not confront in anger situations, but withdraw. So that was a nice bit of the cultural spin. For the most part, the Donnie played the pan-cultural game on basic facial expressions of anger. But in this one instance, the culture overrode it. The upshot of it was that I got more and more involved with emotions, and I've spent the last, 30 years working on emotions. Moved from New Guinea to West Sumatra. I'd always wanted to work in an old high culture, and the language was, Minangkabau is very close to the national language of Indonesia and Malaysia. So it was possible then various things intervened. Our marriage didn't last, we got divorced. I was out in the Bay Area for 4 years, spent visiting at Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, a year at the Center for Advanced Studies, and doing a lot of writing, starting to writing things about the Dani, and getting more and more involved in visual anthropology.
Was this when you edited the volume on visual anthropology?
No, I didn't.
Didn't you edit a volume?
No, did I? I don't think so.
That's what I remember.
I've been in, so it's when I wrote ethnographic film, the first
right.
edition of
That's
that,
right. That's what I meant.
and various other things, and organized conferences and so forth. And then finally, that was a moment when there weren't many jobs. I had tenure at Brown. Eleanor could not get a job at Brown or anywhere in the New England area. So she got a job at Berkeley, tenure track at Berkeley in psychology. And I walked out of my tenure job at Brown, came out there and was sort of 4 years in limbo. And then got the University of South Carolina wanted a chair of a new department of anthropology. And so I went there. And have been there ever since, 33 years now. And started then thinking about a second fieldwork project, working in Minangkabau and working on emotion. And we went we spent a year at my wife and I. I was, when I left California, I was not married, and got to South Carolina and almost immediately met a native, Maley, and we'd been married for 30.
How do you pronounce spell Maley?
Maley, M-A-L-I-E. Her real name is Mary Elizabeth, but all the women in her family are named Mary, so she's an actress and a writer and so forth. But by the time we had a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old, we went to Sumatra for the first time. And I did, that time we spent a year in Sumatra, came home for a year, spent a second year, and I did the basic work on emotions, published that in 1991 as Landscapes of Emotion with Cambridge University Press. And also, more or less just for fun, I'd spend the evenings, I'd rent Indonesian movies on videotape from stores in the town and just listen to them, thinking how horrible they were, but they were probably good for my language. I was teaching anthropology at the provincial university in Indonesian, so I wanted to work on my Indonesian. I'd spent a year at Cornell for the intensive Indonesian course, and then went to Sumatra. Partway through the year, I realized these were not bad American movies. They were good Indonesian movies based on kinds of principles that I was getting from my emotion research. And in the end, did a study on Indonesian cinema, also came out in 1991, and that was taking Indonesian films as cultural texts and analyzing them and working people who don't like that kind of level say that's essentializing. People who are comfortable working at that level say, well, these are good cultural generalizations. I think that using the films, the feature films as texts, was very important in supporting the detailed ethnographic analysis of emotion behavior. So they really complemented each other in a very nice way. And on the whole, American anthropology has not been very much interested in looking at cinema. There was one brilliant book, 1950, called Movies by Wolfenstein and Leitis. Wolfenstein was an anthropologist who worked with Mead and Bateson and Benedict during the Second World War, looking a very nice comparison of English, French, and American movies and relating them to basic principles of these three cultures. Again, very essentializing, but really nice. So I was working with that, and I built in use of video, thinking about the Bateson and Mead work on Bali, which the closer I looked at it, the more sloppy it was methodologically. And they really latched onto this one boy, Karba, and didn't do systematic work at all. But brilliant, but like so much of what Margaret did, even Gregory.
Did you know those two?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Anything to say about it? It hasn't been said about it.
Oh, goodness. I don't think so. I don't think so. It's all been said.
Okay.
They were, I dedicated the first edition of ethnographic film to the two of them. Just.
So you did admire them?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. You know, there were things, especially that Margaret did, especially as she got older, that, yeah, were even embarrassing, but goodness.
On the side, on the Mead-Freeman controversy, which side did you on, or were you in the middle?
I was engaged, certainly Margaret, and I'd written an article. It had been a manuscript. It was published as the Rashomon effect, when ethnographers disagree. And it was about the great, we grew up with Oscar Lewis and Redfield and various other kinds of things. Well, what's going on here? And there've been enough of those. And so this was about the kind of baggage that people bring to the field and how this affects what they see and what they do, what kind of people they are, what their theoretical positions are, and so forth. And I passed it around and had tried to have a session at the Association for Social Anthropology in Oceania meetings, and had given a copy to George Appel. And he said, oh, this is very interesting. You know, my thesis advisor has been saying for years that Margaret Mead is wrong, but he can't publish until Margaret Mead's dead.
This was Derek Freeman.
Yes, it was Derek Freeman. And of course, Derek didn't publish until after Margaret died. But I think that proves my case. I mean, in almost every respect, They're working at different times in different places. He was a huge New Zealander. She was a tiny American. He was ultimately macho. She was bisexual. He was talking to the chiefs. What, my daughter have sex? She was talking to the girls. Oh yeah, let me tell you about sex. And you know, we'll never know what actually was going on. But
It's a very good summer.
we certainly don't have any problem figuring out why he had one version and she had another version. So, so there were various kinds of.
And you were going to do a better version of Bali character.
Yeah, I didn't have so much objections. I wasn't challenging their Balinese data. I've been a tourist in Bali, and no, but their methodology, which was a brilliant idea, I did it very systematically and picked 8 boys and 8 girls and 8 one-year-olds and 8 3-year-olds, and did exactly the same observations or interviews or videotaping with each one, and did that for 2 years and got very comparable data. And using video as part of the research, not intending to make an ethnographic film about Minangkabau, but using it as research. And that's, in the end, I couldn't use it. I retire in 1 year, and I'll spend a year writing somewhere. I'm looking for a nice place where other people are doing serious work and are interested in what I'm. So that's one of the things.
Why could you not use it? Because of time constraints, or because of the intimacy of the? You said you couldn't use it.
Oh, well, the problem is because of intimacy,
Yeah.
I had to flatten out so many of the. I mean, one of the girls was doing all kinds of things that were so, anybody who knew that area would know who I'm talking about. And I had to flatten out all that, just leave out a whole lot of things, assign them random names, where their names were wonderful, like Ronald Reagan, because he was born in 1980, and Lily Marlene. I mean, you know, all the interesting trivia I had to flatten out, and I was very, yeah. And it turned out that one of the girls in 2001, when I went back and was teaching again at the provincial university, I was teaching a course in psychological anthropology, and that little girl shows up as an undergraduate in that course. And thank goodness, I hadn't published the facts that would have just made her cringe. Anyway, so I still have to figure out how to finish that. I've got books and articles that are kind of half finished and need a little more work.
It's just coming near the end of the.
Yeah. Okay. Basically, let's fast forward to present.
Yeah.
What I'm most interested in, I'm interested in ethnographic film, but we've got a pretty good, there are some wonderful ethnographic films at this conference.
Yeah.
We know how to do that. What we're not doing successfully, what I'm really interested in at this point, is showing how visuals can be used to enhance ethnographic research, not to create a new field. I mean, I like what Steve Feld did this morning with the sound of the waves and the ocean and the feeling. But for emotion research, for psychological anthropology, when we're asking questions about emotion and folk psychology, How can we use video to enhance that? And that's what the challenge is, because it's not clear. And it's certainly this next conference on visual anthropology. I'm not sure that will touch these kinds of questions. And that's what I hope to do. I've got partially finished papers and such that I want to get out and show what visual anthropology can be. I've got a whole list of like 25 different kinds of approaches in visual anthropology. And I've put number 16, ethnographic film. And all these other things have gotten started but not developed, so they're not part of our regular methodology and our regular way of thinking about how to do ethnography. And that's what I see for my immediate future. I'd still love to do an ethnographic film on the Minangkabau and do another round of emotion research. But I feel I need to get this out of the way first, develop it. And I'm really, actually very excited about it. I've spent the last 3 years being an administrator at my university, and stopped doing that this weekend. So
Congratulations.
on Monday I'm a professor again, and I'm really looking forward to that.
That's a lovely note to end on. So that was fascinating, George. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's always nice to be able to talk about oneself.
I was now calling you George, but Karl.